Well, good evening. Am I audible? There we are. Can you hear me in the bleachers? No? It's on. They're just joking with you. Really? Okay, I'm audible. Good. It's great to see such a wonderful turnout for this event tonight. This is a new experiment for us, having it at 6:30 rather than the afternoon, and we didn't know how it would be received, but obviously you're all here for this event. So we do appreciate it, and we may do that again. Uh, the New Oxford Area Historical Society, in cooperation with Cross Keys, sponsors about 4 of these events a year. And you have all been very generous in coming out, and it's great to have you, you can share your interest in the history of New Oxford because with me and Mike and others, because we're passionately interested in it. And you'll hear a good deal about it this evening. There is some occasional confusion about what we just had. We had Harvest Fest downtown on the square. Any of you come down to that? Can you raise your hands? Good, a good number of you. And somebody said, well, is New Oxford only 150 years old? And no, it's much older than that. What we celebrated is the 150th anniversary of the incorporation of the town, the creation of the borough. That was 1874, and certainly well worth commemorating because it's when New Oxford really came of age. But we're going back into the dim recesses of New Oxford tonight, to Oxford Town, to Butcher Stand, all sorts of things, back to the 1790s when this community began to come together. And our speaker tonight is Mike Shen, who's the president of the New Oxford Area Historical Society. And Mike I will just tell you this about him. He is a historical researcher as well as an administrative organizer. Those two qualities don't often come together, but they do in Mike. He's the hardest working man in show business. And so you'll enjoy his talk tonight. Let me mention one event that is coming up. It's mentioned on this little handout that we had, and that is December 15th. It's a Sunday at 6:30. We will be having holiday caroling on the square. So if you want to come out and sing the old carols, join us. We will be meeting we start at the Methodist Church. We'll be meeting at Emory Methodist Church right down on the square. That's at 6:30 on that Sunday, the December 15th. So, and we kind of go around the area, a few blocks here and there, and sing at people's houses. And it's great fun. And I think there's refreshments afterwards at the church, at the Methodist Church. So if you're cold, you can warm up probably with some hot chocolate and so on. So that's the preliminary comments. Again, we're thrilled to have you all come, and it's my pleasure to introduce Mike Shen, our president, to talk about the evolution of the square. Mike.
Thanks, Bob. Now, can you hear me in the back? No? Okay. Let me do this. How about, is that better? Yep. Okay, great. Well, this is ooh boy, that is loud. Now you can hear me, right? Okay. Well, this is a great evening because this gives us, this is the closing event that had been planned as part of this 150th birthday anniversary for the borough's formation. The plans for that started taking shape earlier this year, and it involved, of course, the Borough of New Oxford, the Chamber of Commerce, the Adams County Historical Society, and ourselves. So over the course of the summer, there's been a range of programs I hope you had a chance to enjoy. And this is the last of that celebration, where we wanted to explore and understand and enjoy a few moments as it relates to what we view as being an incredibly precious gift that our founders, the borough founders, transferred down through the generations, and that is the center square of New Oxford. So I'm hoping that this evening will be both entertaining as well as insightful, and that you have a chance to feel inspired every time you go around the circle to think about the people and the things that have happened in the past that make the square what it is and the circle what it is today. Let me first ask, how many of you, if you could just do a quick raise of hands straw poll, how many of you have attended one of our earlier programs during the course of this year? Could you raise your hand? Thank you very much. A round of applause. Thank you for supporting us. How many of you are current members of the New Oxford Area Historical Society? Very nice. Even a louder round of applause. If you have a chance and you feel as though that you would like to continue to support us or support us for the first time, go to our website, newoxfordareahistory.org, and you can sign up there. So let's dive into the history of the New Oxford Center Square. So it's useful to, before you dig into a topic, to actually define things and to also organize your one's thoughts. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend some time on what I call before anything. And then after some things happen and some things appear, we'll go into the earliest years, leading then into the transformation time, which then leads to a lot of commerce, a lot of change, and a tremendous amount of civic pride. So that's the journey we're going to be going on this evening. Now, there's a lot of confusion out there as to what this really is. What's the proper nomenclature? So is it a diamond, is it a square, or is it a circle? And the short answer is, it depends. It depends on when you're asking the question. It depends on what you're actually trying to describe. And it also depends on who in the time period that you're in. So in the earliest years, up through the early mid-19th century, I'll show you that, that in fact it's not a square, it's a diamond. And then it becomes a square, but even though it had been identified as a square on the plat, that terminology continues and we embrace it today. But then the circle comes in, and the circle comes in once the transformation has been undertaken. So here's our diamond on the plat, the New Oxford plat. And if you're coming in from Hanover Street, for example, and you want to go to down Pitt Street, excuse me, you're not going to go to the center of the diamond and then turn left. What are you going to do? You're going to turn left. And so it is among all of these four arteries that made up the center of New Oxford, the diamond. And there's elements of that diamond that you can see in photographs today. And then you have a square. Well, the square is clearly, this is an aerial, and it's clearly the outline of the buildings, the town lots, and all of the open space that exists within. And of course, the circle happens once our borough founders decide that they're going to create a park. And that park is going to center itself inside the square and obliterate the diamond. So before anything, that time, this was just a series of patchworks of roads in the mid 1700s, late 1700s, that as populations were beginning to move into the Scotch-Irish, the Germans were beginning to move into the region. So the most important was in 1747, both the Great Wagon Road to Black's Gap and the Great Wagon Road to Nichols Gap passed through. This came from York through Berwick, which we now call Abbottstown, through what is now New Oxford, and then it either made its way to the north up to Hunterstown and beyond to Black's Gap, or it made its way down to Marsh Creek, which is now Gettysburg, and down this way. So a lot of traffic was happening through on that great road in the 1740s and after. So much so that this became the main immigration route into the interior of the United States, Cumberland Valley, and then the Ohio Valley. So these are the land plots that Frederick Kuhn bought, these two dates. And this is the trace of that Great Wagon Road running right through his property. And it's for that reason, the Great Wagon Road, that he bought the property. He saw it as an opportunity. Now, what's interesting is if you rotate and you try to get this map oriented to today's familiar coordinates, this line represents Lincoln Way East and Lincoln Way West. This line represents Carlisle Street, and this line represents Berlin Road. So the Great Wagon Road came right through, not along what we consider to be the main thoroughfare today, but on a diagonal. And right there is his tavern, his barn, and his stables. Now, for the longest time then, up from the 1740s, almost 1750, until the 1770s, which is 20 some years later, this was the only route through. But then he develops these two roads, the route to his mill, which is up in Newchester. That's the reason why we have the road going up to Newchester. And then the road that he wanted to take the products from the mill and get it down to Baltimore. So he convinces the quarter session to authorize in 1780 a road from the mill conveniently past his tavern on its way down to Hanover and then Baltimore. Now, at this time, the design characteristics of towns, squares, and early Pennsylvania towns pretty much followed a grid-like pattern universally. So this, of course, is the New Oxford or Oxford town plat. And you see that, and this being Philadelphia in 1681, again, the main arteries with the center square. Gettysburg was laid out the same in 1786. Berlin, which is actually East Berlin, never did have or was never laid out with a center square. One of the rare examples in this region, both Hunterstown as well as Berwick. both included, our nearest neighbors both included Center Square. But just like in the case of Gettysburg, where they placed the courthouse initially at the center of the square, for those of you in Philadelphia, you know that City Hall sits right here. So, but there was nothing ever placed in New Oxford. So these center squares really were places for conducting business. This is the Gettysburg town plat, and this is the original courthouse, which was torn down in I believe it was around 1850 something, because the current courthouse is 1860. But that was positioned in the center here. But what's really interesting to see is that even though Gettysburg is the county seat, its town square is appreciably smaller. And many times I believe that when you get something that, supersedes the competition by almost twice, 2x, you have a reason to be proud. In fact, I'm going to propose that the reason why our town square is so much larger than it is in Gettysburg is because when it was laid out, Henry Kuhn was doing everything he could possibly do to lure the county seat to be located in New Oxford. It was the tradition of the time to build the county seat in the center of the square. A county courthouse should have been located there, but it wasn't. In these earliest years, New Oxford instead was a pretty sleepy little town. By 1812, 20 years almost afterwards, there were only 22 houses. 1839, well, guess what? Hadn't really grown by much, as well as 1846. Notice also, there are really no merchants to speak of. There are tradesmen, there are millers, there are blacksmiths, etc., etc. But there are no real merchants per se for hats or clothing or groceries. But by 1880, it actually had grown quite a bit. So in this 1850 view, you can see that the total population is pretty modest, but again, it's the tradesmen that dominate. This is information that you can ascertain from the census. Pretty straightforward. Also, the map that was done in 1858 doesn't show a lot of activity, although it does give a business directory, and boy, that was something to be proud of at the time. But again, there were only 3 merchants, a boot for boots, shoes, and clothing. Everyone else, places of worship, a schoolhouse, and a number of tradesmen. No merchants, few merchants. We're blessed to have actually a first-hand account of what the community looks like. This was drawn by and remembered by George Emmert when he was a young boy and grew up here, that shows, for the most part, fairly accurate. Some variations from reality, but hey, this was done in the 19-teens, and he's recollecting some 60 years prior, 50 years prior, not too bad. But it also shows that there really is nothing going on here, and there's a lot of tradesmen. it's beautiful because it shows where barns are, where stone houses are, where log houses are, or even orchards are. And in fact, many of you have seen this photograph of the center of New Oxford looking down Philadelphia Street in the winter of 1862, taken from the second-story window of the Himes house on Lincoln Way West, right on the corner. Top corner window of the house, front corner. Here, after a snowstorm, you can see the diamond. Hanover Street down here, Philadelphia Street here, Pittsburgh Street coming out to the rear, and Carlisle Street up this way. And of course, after the snow, there had been traffic going straight up and down, north-south. There had been traffic going straight east-west. There had been traffic going up. Let's go down Philadelphia Street or Pittsburgh Street and follow the diamond. And in fact, if you have these quintessential images of what was previously the Coons Tavern, but at the time was the Washington House. This was taken in the early 1870s. And this is 1859, 1860. You can see that, so but envision that this house is a little bit on angle. It's not lined up with the street in the square as it's currently configured. It's on a little bit of an angle. And this is this path here is, if you're following the diamond coming from Philadelphia Street up to Carlisle Street. That's the shortcut. And here's the shortcut here. But if you were going to be staying overnight in the hotel or grab a pint at the tavern, you'd pull in to hitch your horse. Hitch your horse. We don't do anything other than hitch horses. Now, the nice thing about this is that this photograph is actually taken when the Emmert Building is constructed, but the circle has not. So it narrows down the time period. So if we look at population, New Oxford, it just kind of keeps mounting. But there is a little bit of an inflection point, but that's just simply because of population and economic activity that is happening in the post-Civil War period, pre-1900. And, but it does illustrate that it had gone from, less than 300 folks in 1850 to 500 and then over 600 folks. And by 1880, the borough had just been established. So it was really taking off. Economic activity was really taking off in this 1890s to 1900 range. And the reason I wanted to show this is that because you can, relative to the prior map I showed, which was in 1858, this is the 72 map, you can see that there'd been appreciable amount of growth. And this is also sets the stage because this is 1872, 2 years prior to the incorporation as a borough. So you can see that activity is happening, growth is happening, people are building homes, people are opening up businesses, things are changing relative to the past. And in fact, then, in the spring of 1874, Dr. Hendricks, who lived on Lincoln Way West, along with the citizens, then submitted the petition to the Adams County Court for the establishing the borough of New Oxford and for it to become incorporated. That was granted, and so then The actual birthday is a summer birthday, the 20th of August of that year. In order to get ready for the legal proceedings and the petition that would be submitted to the court, of course, the founders had to define, well, what's going to be in the borough. So then they hire well-known resident of New Oxford, Joseph Gitt, who then produces and surveys and produces this plat of the original boundaries of the borough of New Oxford and the various streets. And you can see here clearly, even at the time when the borough was founded, nothing has really happened inside the square. Relative to all of the prior maps and such, really the only thing appreciably different is the appearance of these town lots as you head out what is now Lincoln Way West. That was referred to as Deal's Addition. The Deal family sold or donated the land to the borough and for turning into town lots. So keep this in mind. This is October of '74. They have their first meeting, October 13th, of the Borough Council, right in that building, in the building for D.A. Miller. That's on the northeast corner of the town square. This residence, this dwelling here, does no longer exist. In fact, the Livingston building exists in advance of or in front of this, as well as the Methodist Church occupies land in front here, which was originally part of the square but no longer. So the earliest public reference to a public square appears in the November 28th, 1874 Borough Council records. This is the Borough Council logbook, and the borough was kind enough to allow me to examine it in preparation of this talk and for the anniversary. So this first paragraph, and this is literally a month after their first meeting, right? Because it's October. But some of the most pressing questions or actions of the day were to, law and order. And in fact, it all has to do with disturbing the peace. And this phrase here refers to being enacted the Burgess and the town borough, and it was hereby enacted by authority that the following offenses shall be considered as against good order in government, viz. Disturbing the peace by night or by day, by shooting, unnecessary shouting, yelling, or other unnecessary noise proceedings. Congregating of persons on the public square or corners of the streets or pavements, in front of churches on Sabbath, or any other evening when services may be held there. Intoxication on the streets, or when intoxicated to become noisy, indecent, or otherwise disorderly. But this is where they make first mention in the official records of the public square. Notice they also referred to it as the public square. This second section here has to do with, no, you're not going to be allowed to dig a hole or steal the sod from the public square. Now, it's useful to look at what was going on in the neighboring communities in that time period. So this is in Gettysburg. Even in the 1780s, 1770s, 1780s, even though there had been the courthouse that occupied the public square, before which it was then torn down in 1860, they never really did anything with it for the longest time. In fact, the circle in Gettysburg appeared much later, after the circle appeared in New Oxford. Down in Hanover, this is an image taken in 1863 of the center square, and this heads down to Frederick. This heads up to the north, and this was a market, covered market. That's what populated the center square. Again, it was for a place to gather. But then by 1895, see what had happened. They had built a circle, little fountain and such. And then this is just a comparison of how Chambersburg was in the late 18th century. Again, an open framework, an open space. In fact, during the Civil War, there are many records that show that the volunteers and the companies, as they were being formed, would train and do their drilling on those open public squares, including the public square in New Oxford. There are multiple accounts in the newspaper of that having happened. There was nothing to stop them, and that's where the public gathering places existed. So the borough now, Borough Council, in December of 1874, they start focusing their attention on improving the streets. And by summer of the year after, let's say 11 months after the borough's formation, they actually have received from Joseph Gitt, the surveyor, the plan for improving the public square, predicated on them raising private funds. They needed to raise $500 from the public before the borough would consider going forward with the project. The fact that this happened within 11 months after the borough's formation tells me that this was a high priority for the borough founders. In fact, the only other actions prior to this were improving the streets, because the streets were in horrible shape. 150 years of dust and dirt and ruts. So then, by July, a month later, they've already raised the $500. People wanted a different public square, something that they could be proud of. That's roughly equivalent to $2,800 today. And Joseph Gitt is then named as the project superintendent and the overseer to measure its progress. So the first thing that starts happening is grading and changing of elevations. How many people have walked through town to observe the variances in grading relative to the houses that are there? Many times you'll find that a cellar window is half exposed. That's because of all of the grading that was going on, some of which that took place when the Lincoln Highway was paved, but some of it of which happened as far back as the fall of 1875. And then once the grading of the streets takes place, they can start to specify the sidewalks and the footwalks. And they're also making reference to the footwalks in the public square. So they're doing all of this with a purpose. So this is our friend Joseph Gitt. He's born in 1815 down in McSherrystown. His family is settled in Hanover and became a very, very accomplished family in the history of this region. He was educated in the 1830s, late 1830s at Gettysburg College. He was a school teacher. He was an editor and proprietor of newspapers and weeklies in Hanover. And he became a civil engineer for a lot of railroads. Pennsylvania Railroad, the Western Maryland Railroad, and on and on and on and on. The man was truly a Renaissance man because he also loved history, a man that I love. But he lived in New Oxford on Lincoln Way West, in the house adjacent to what is Slater's now. And but he was buried in Hanover at Mount Olivet Cemetery. He laid out Mount Olivet Cemetery. So there were influences, I believe, that led to what the town the Borough Council decided to move forward with. First of all, you can't help but ignore the fact that your neighbors are doing things that are making your square look transforming your square into something that was an open space to something that is actually very, very charming. Also, period trends at that period, in that time, at the end of the 19th century, were favoring the establishment or the creation of public squares, public spaces within cities and towns. It's not just the singular landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, that does the Capitol grounds as well as Central Park, but it's a whole host of urban planners that are transforming these open spaces into places of recreation and to pass your time. And this actually begins to happen earliest in New York City with Union Park in 1845. This is in front of the City Hall, and look at this beautiful town park, complete with a fence, a fountain, and lovely walkways. And of course, during this period of time, this precedes the adoption of more English garden, wild-like park settings to ones that are well manicured, well laid out, which are referred to as geometric garden design. This was the typical garden design and public space design of the era. So our friend Joseph Gitt, who is an incredibly learned man, incredibly accomplished, had moved beyond the area. He was aware of all of these things to where he comes up with his design, which he proposes to the Borough Council, and they adopt. So 1876, the work is happening. They even talk about the posts and chains to enclose the circle. Hitching posts that are needed, obviously, and of course, trees. How does that, it starts to make you think about that picture of New York City almost on the previous slide. And then, but by May of 1875, the seeding of the grass, the enclosure, all and the rubbish, everything is all complete. May of 1875, they have essentially transformed that public square from a dusty, dirty crossroads into a circle and a park for the community. It did not take long, a month, for the public to say, we would petition the borough, we would really like to hold our 4th of July fireworks display on the public square, in the circle. Now, 1876, what is that? 100 years after. They got started with this project in 1874. I think they had the goal, not only was it a high priority, they had a purpose. And they wanted to have this completed by the time the centennial was going to be celebrated. Because the centennial was a big deal. Full of pride in what our ancestors did to create this country and the lives that were given so that we may vote and we may have a voice to the people. So here's some earlier photos from the early 20th century. Shows the recreation in the park, in the center square, in the circle, with our chains and our posts. And of course, there's our Grecian vases. Some people might call them urns, but I guess the proper nomenclature is a vase. And then afterwards, it's just improvements. Lighting with lamp posts. There were no trees initially, evidently. So it took time for them to put, or else the trees died, the initial trees died. Anyways, more trees were added. And then in April of 77, next spring, there was a petition to place bird boxes on the square. And in fact, here the borough gives them approval to put a bird box on the square. And then here the borough says, no. So here's a postcard. You can find these, they're rather abundant on eBay, for example. Colorized, early 20th century, most likely. But prior to when when electric was brought in and telephone were brought in to New Oxford, which was somewhere around the early 19 teens. I forget exactly which year, but I think it's around 14 or 16, something like that. And again, if you look real carefully, you can see that right in the center is one of the larger of the urns. It's hard to make out with all of the. So then improvements go on, and walkways are added and improved upon. So in the 1880s. But I think what's interesting to look at now is relative to Gettysburg, where the action is really happening, being the county seat. Already by 1886, businesses had dominated the frontal space of the center square. This is a list of all of the businesses. Very few dwellings. It's literally a place of business. Whereas in New Oxford, the earliest Sanborn maps we have are 1912 and 1929, but it's really a mix of both dwellings and businesses, along with open space. You would never have seen the open space in the Gettysburg at this time, by this time. So this goes to show you that there was literally, it was still a playing second fiddle, if you will, to Gettysburg. You can, when you zoom in between 1912 and 1929, you see that really the only substantial changes on the square is up here. This is where the Park Hotel is, where the Eagle. And in 1912, they still had the barns and the stables. They had been eradicated and make way for what is now the post office. Some changes, few changes here, which is the Livingston building. And then down here on the southwest corner, this is where the old drugstore was. This is Hanover Street. This is the Himes House. You see some changes here as well, going from a clapboard building to a different structure, but not too much change. But when you look at the newspapers and you try to pick out like the merchants and the ads, get a flavor of what was going on. At the time when this was a diamond and not a square or a circle, you had a tavern. Allabaugh's had built the first building on the corner of Hanover and the South Hanover Street and the in the square where the dentist is located now, the prior building there. That's what this is. Of course, the hotel, the Eagle Hotel, which became the Park, and then Weiss later on, the proprietor of the Eagle Hotel, built a town hall and that's the reason why the Eagle Hotel has the upper level, because the original hotel was only 2 stories. He built a 3rd story for a town hall or a town meeting place. This is actually a photograph that was probably taken somewhere in the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s. This is where the Livingston building is now. And this is Aaron Hagee. He had a dry goods store right on the corner. During the Civil War, he was down the pike on Philadelphia Street, further to the east. But then by this time, he had moved to a more prominent place on the square. And then this is Miller's, which I believe was a general mercantile. But then as the circle gets established, you see more prominent buildings becoming constructed. So here's the Emmert's Corner, or Emmert's Building, which is where the old bank is now, Merchants Bank. And even though that was in the 1870s, preceded the establishment of the circle, these buildings in between did not exist. This was the post office, and this post office becomes built around 1897. When Emmert actually becomes the postmaster. Convenient. Then the Livingston building gets built in the late 1890s to replace that clapboard building that I showed you with the Aaron Hagee's mercantile. And then this is the second store, the second shop that got built on the corner of Hanover and the square where the dentist is located now. The dentist building was the 3rd iteration of the structure at this location. This is the second. The first was much more crude, clapboard. This is a brick building. And of course, on the west side of the square, of course, is the Miller Building. And that replaced the old Coon stables and the barn that were associated with the tavern. He purchases this lot for the building March of 1884 for $1,200. That's quite a lot of money at the time because of prime real estate. And that's in the spring of 84. By the spring of 85, he's already moved into it. I find it amazing that this building was, now without the presence of this add-on here, but just the principal structure, 3 levels, would have been built in 1 year. I find that just amazing. But and this is useful because J.E.C. Miller has removed his hardware store into his new building, the largest and best of its kind in the county. Shealy and Brothers have also removed their dry goods store into the same building, and C.E. Deal his grocery store. So you can see that it was really a piece of prime real estate. A month later, when the Gettysburg Compiler has an update, talks about a large building has been erected in the corner of the public square of Pitt Street, handsome, tall, just been completed. The building in which there are 3 of the largest storerooms in the place or county, occupied by a hardware, dry goods, and grocery. In the 3rd story is the hall, furnished with chairs sufficient to seat an audience of 300 persons, a stage across one end of the room, and beautiful hanging lamps to light up the room at night. That's up here. Now this photograph, this happens actually in 1885. This photograph is in the early 1900s, middle 1900s, because around I think it's around 1906, 1905, somewhere like that, they are told, thou shalt not have any gatherings in the hall, the 3rd story hall, because there was no escape. They had to install the emergency escape ladders on the front and on the side from the upper hall. Then they could open it up. So this picture is actually post that period.
Right. Just in case anybody doesn't know that this is Deja Brew now.
Yeah, this is where the Deja Brew is now. So growth is happening by the time in the 1890s, 1900. Gilbert and Son. Well, Gilbert and Sons, there was a hardware store, and the Gilbert family purchased the old Coon Tavern, which was a derelict in the 1880s, around 1885, 1887. They tear it down. Prime real estate. They build the current structure that's there now, a home for their family, and a hardware store to the side. The building we see today is not the Coon Tavern. If anyone mentions to you that this is the Coon's Tavern, you say, no, 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 no. This is where the Coon's Tavern was. This is not the Coon's Tavern. That's the Gilbert residence. Pius Knoll, who was a renowned businessman in the area with his groceries and other wines and gins and brandies. And of course, the meat market, B.F. Geis, which was also, look at this, middle room Livingston Building, Center Square. So the Livingston Building and the Miller Building were the two anchors, if you will. Everything, and then with the two hotels, the one hotel. At the time, the only hotel that remained was the Eagle Hotel or the Park Hotel. And then a lot of businesses surrounding. And then, of course, by the mid-20th century, there's a lot more commerce coming and going. And this is when the telephone and electric lines appear. This is a photo in 1929, and it shows the telephone lines running through the square. In fact, in the early 1900s, it's not included here, but I found a reference where the Borough Council allowed the telephone company access to the public square. It breaks my heart. Who else has a broken heart because of the lines over the public square? And of course, there's a variety of shops that come and go. The 1950s, 1960s, war period, interwar period, thriving businesses occurring around the square. It has literally become the center of commerce. And with a public park and with a unique space that shines relative to all of the other public squares in the county, in the region, comes a lot of pride, a lot of civic pride that continues to this day. And I hope you feel as proud as I do of the public square that we have in our backyard. In 1974, when the borough was celebrating its centennial, the Centennial Commission were issuing as a fundraiser these certificates for ownership of 1 square inch of the public square. It was notarized. This one was certificate was issued to Charles Gladfelter, and I believe he only bought 1 inch. But we have other, in our collection, we have other certificates that have been donated where folks were buying multiple square inches. But the purpose of this was to help keep the town circle and the public square truly a historic place that does not get defamed or seriously altered in the future, because it is a historic landmark that relative to the region that we have in our backyard. So that's a brief talk about how we got to the public square in the town circle today. Any questions? Yes. The park, the original configuration and the Joseph Gitt plan was for the circle. In 1875 is when they enclosed it, and by spring of 1876, they were planting the trees and planting the grass. It was a park. It was an enclosed park in the form of a circle. And so it was a traffic circle. And in fact, um, shortly thereafter, in the late 1880s, 1890s, there is a borough council ordinance that requires parties entering the square to go right and not go left. In fact, that photograph of the Miller Building, for any of you that noticed the wagon, that was pointed in the wrong direction. And but that had happened, that photograph was taken after that ordinance had been also enacted. Out in the back? Yes, ma'am. Well, the question was, why is New Oxford called New Oxford? And it goes back to the 1840s and even beyond. So when it was first laid out, it was laid out with the name Oxford or Oxford Town. But then in 1840s, with the postal system, there was confusion between this Oxford in Adams County and the town of Oxford that's over in, what I think, Montgomery, is it Montgomery County? Chester County. So then the name was changed to New Oxford. There was a question here, yes?
Traffic. Are there a lot of accidents of people passing through that don't understand circles?
Yeah, are there a lot of accidents? The answer is yes. And in the Borough Council records, you see from in those early 1900s, you see multiple entries of repair work to the posts. And guess what happens to this day? Repair work to the posts. Those are the more minor issues, but there are examples of people, driving through the circle, breaking through the chain. Unfortunately, they don't pay attention.
Well, the tractor trailer traffic, and right now, if you go up through New Oxford any day during the week, you're jammed up way back through. And getting those big tractor trailers through there, I mean, I think it's amazing.
Well, it's an interesting observation about the traffic today around the circle. Yes, if we sort of push off to the side the construction that with the gas company and the delays that it's creating currently, and but you look at the nascent traffic patterns, there are a lot of tractor trailer trucks for which our town circle is actually bigger than the Gettysburg town circle, so I'm even more amazed about how they make it around Gettysburg. Here, I'm not so amazed by. But, they take it slow, but in Gettysburg, they really have to work at it. Any other questions? Yes? Ah, the fountain, yes. So, I don't know the answer to that question because I did not go that deep into but somebody here might know. When was the fountain put into the circle? Does anyone know? Yes.
I can't say exactly what year, but I know in 1973, there was no town, it was still trees. I graduated from high school then. But when shortly after I moved away, went to college and then was living on in New Oxford, there was a really bad storm. And the really bad storm destroyed a lot of the trees in the center of New Oxford. Somebody maybe who was here, I'm thinking late 70s or in the 1980s.
Yeah.
early 80s.
The,
And so then they come replace the trees with big tree trunks, so the oak trees were very old. And so that's when they paved things over, put a fountain in, fixed streets.
And some of those trees were 100 years old because they were put in the 1870s.
Very dramatic when that storm destroyed.
Yeah.
Big old trees on the square.
Some of the photographs, the early photographs, images of the circle, you can see that that in early 20th century and through I think much of the 20th century, there was a flagpole that marked the center. Now, prior to the flagpole, there are images that show one of the larger Grecian vases as the center. But it certainly was not one of the bird boxes. They said no. Now, before you go, I have something, a little treat, hopefully that you'll enjoy. And I just call it a salute to the New Oxford Center Square. And you can be a circle if you want it, but please don't call it a diamond. Because otherwise, well, let's see what this is. Maybe we can lower the light. Is it possible to lower the lights in the front? So I enjoy doing a little bit of drone flying. So different times of the year, I go out and get some footage. Different angles. This I planned so that it occurred on the proper day, with the proper weather, and at the proper time. You really get an appreciation of that classic design, geometric design. And with the trees, I'd say they're equally beautiful. Get a chance to see the Miller Building here. Here's where the Gilbert House is, the Park Hotel, Livingston Building, and beyond. Okay, who feels inspired to enjoy your evening and to salute the Center Square when you next go by? Thank you very much.